The gentle hum of the car engine faded into the background as I turned onto the winding road that led to my sister's house. It was late spring, and the countryside unfolded before me in lush greens and wildflower blooms. Her home was a vision of tranquility, a sprawling property tucked away from the chaos of city life, complete with a private golf course stretching lazily across the backyard. I'd been coming here for years, though not as frequently as my sister liked. She always teased me for being too wrapped up in my work, and maybe she was right. As a psychologist, my days were filled with listening, analyzing, and helping others navigate their tangled lives. I was good at it, too, but it left little space for me to sit with my own emotions. This time, though, it wasn't just my sister who drew me here. It was Ryan. I pulled into the long gravel driveway and spotted him instantly. He was on the course, his stance wide and confident as he took a practice swing. His lithe figure was backlit by the sun, and for a moment I almost didn't recognize him. The lanky boy I used to chase around at family gatherings had grown into something else entirely. He was taller now, broader in the shoulders, his hair tousled in that effortless way that made him look like he'd just stepped out of a magazine spread. I parked and made my way to the porch, waving at my sister as she opened the door. Ryan glanced up from his game, squinting against the sunlight, and I felt his gaze land on me. He smiled, a slow, easy grin that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. It wasn't the same boyish smile I remembered from his childhood. It was different, laced with a confidence that I couldn't quite place. "About time you got here," my sister teased, pulling me into a hug. "Ryan's been asking when you'd show up." My cheeks warmed slightly at her words. It was a casual comment, but the thought of Ryan anticipating my visit left a strange flutter in my chest. After catching up with my sister over tea, I found myself wandering toward the course. The rhythmic thwack of Ryan's club against the ball was oddly soothing, and I paused to watch him from a distance. He was good. His movements fluid, precise, like he was in complete control. I envied that about him. At 18, he seemed to possess a certainty about himself that I didn't think I'd ever had, even now in my 30s. "You're staring, Auntie." I startled at the sound of his voice and realized he was looking directly at me, a mischievous glint in his eye. Embarrassed, I laughed and walked over, hoping my blush wasn't too obvious. "Just admiring your form," I said, trying to sound casual. He raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. "Oh. And what's your professional analysis?" I rolled my eyes. "Confident. Maybe a little too confident." He chuckled, but there was something in his gaze that lingered. "You're not wrong." We fell into an easy rhythm as we talked. He handed me a club, insisting I give it a try, and I laughed at how ridiculous I looked compared to his effortless grace. But Ryan was patient, guiding my hands on the grip, adjusting my stance with gentle touches to my shoulders and hips. His nearness was disarming, and I found myself hyper-aware of the warmth of his hands against my skin. "You're overthinking it," he said softly, his breath tickling my ear as he stood behind me. "Just let go." I took a deep breath, trying to focus on the ball, but the only thing I could feel was him. His presence, his energy. When I swung, the ball barely moved and we both erupted into laughter. "You're hopeless," he teased, shaking his head. "Stick to psychology." But there was no malice in his words, only warmth. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the course in hues of gold and amber, I realized how much I enjoyed this. Being here with him, laughing, feeling something that had been absent from my life for far too long. That evening after dinner, Ryan and I found ourselves sitting on the porch swing. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to peek out from the deepening twilight. We talked about everything and nothing, his plans for college, my work, the memories we shared from his childhood. It was easy, comfortable. But then he turned to me, his expression shifting to something more serious. "You know," he began, his voice low, "I used to think you were the coolest person in the world when I was a kid." I laughed, brushing a stray hair from my face. "Used to?" He smiled faintly. "Still do." There was something in his tone that made my breath catch. His gaze held mine, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow, the space between us charged with something unspoken. I felt a flutter of panic. This was Ryan, my nephew, and yet... I stood abruptly, breaking the moment. "It's getting late," I said, my voice tight. "We should head inside." He nodded, though his eyes never left mine. Yeah. Of course. As I climbed the stairs to my room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't deny the spark that had ignited. The quiet thrill of a connection that was as impossible as it was undeniable. The house was quiet, its corners bathed in soft moonlight as the rest of the family slept soundly. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, willing sleep to come. But my thoughts wouldn't quiet. They swirled and stirred, pulling me back to earlier that day. The warmth of Ryan's smile, the way he laughed when I missed the ball entirely during our impromptu golf lesson. There was something about being around him that made me feel lighter, freer, like I wasn't just the responsible, composed adult everyone expected me to be. After tossing and turning for what felt like an eternity, I decided to give up. Slipping on a light sweater, I tiptoed out of the room and made my way outside. The cool night air greeted me as I stepped onto the porch, wrapping around me like a refreshing balm. The countryside was so still, so different from the endless hum of the city. No cars, no crowds, just the sound of crickets and the occasional whisper of the wind. I walked down the porch steps and onto the open field beyond the house. Without the cover of trees or the glare of city lights, the stars looked impossibly bright. The sky stretched out endlessly, a canvas of glittering constellations that seemed to pulse with life. It was breathtaking, and for the first time in hours my restless mind began to calm. I stood there for 5, maybe 10 minutes, just soaking it all in. The stillness. The vastness. It felt like the stars were reminding me of how small my worries were in the grand scheme of things. But then, a faint smell interrupted my moment of reflection. Cigarette smoke. I turned instinctively, scanning the darkness. And then I saw him. Ryan, leaning casually against the side of the house, a cigarette between his fingers. He looked so at ease, so grown up, the glow of the ember casting fleeting shadows across his face. Couldn't sleep? I called softly, stepping closer. He turned his head toward me, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. You either, huh? I shook my head. Too many thoughts. He nodded knowingly and stubbed the cigarette out against the wall before tossing it into a nearby ashtray. You don't mind, do you? He asked, nodding toward where the smoke still lingered. Not at all, I replied. I didn't know you smoked. Only sometimes, he said with a shrug. Usually when I can't sleep. I smiled faintly and turned my gaze back to the stars. I heard his footsteps on the grass as he approached, and then without a word he wrapped his arms around me in a warm, firm hug. I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden closeness, but then I relaxed into it, letting his presence ground me. I missed you, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't realize how much until you got here, he continued, pulling back just enough to look at me. His eyes, usually so playful and teasing, were serious now, filled with something I couldn't quite name. Ryan, I started, but the words died on my tongue. You've always been my favorite, you know, he said, a small smile breaking through the intensity of his gaze. Even when I was a kid, you were the one I wanted to hang out with. You actually listened to me. You never treated me like I was just some dumb kid. I felt a warmth bloom in my chest at his words, and I reached out to brush a stray lock of hair from his forehead. That's because you weren't just some dumb kid. You were always smart, Ryan. And kind. And funny. He grinned at that, though it was softer, more vulnerable than his usual cocky smirk. It's just different now. I mean, I'm not a kid anymore, and you're... What? I prompted, my voice gentle. You're the same, he said after a moment. But not. You're still you, kind, thoughtful, so easy to talk to, but you're more. I don't know how to explain it. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I wasn't sure if it was his words or the way he was looking at me, like I was the only person in the world who mattered in that moment. You're not the same either, I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. You've grown up. You're confident now, sure of yourself. Strange seeing you like this. But in a good way. He smiled again, softer this time, and we stood there in comfortable silence for a while, just watching the stars. The night felt endless, the universe stretching out above us, vast and unknowable. You're going to do amazing things, Ryan, I said eventually, breaking the quiet. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. You really think so? I know so, I replied, meeting his gaze. He didn't say anything for a moment, but then he reached out and took my hand in his fingers warm and steady. You've always believed in me, haven't you? Of course, I said, my voice soft. Always. His grip tightened slightly and he took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. Thank you, he said, and there was something raw in his tone, something that made my chest ache. For what? I asked, my voice barely audible. For being you, he said simply. We stood there like that for what felt like forever, the world around us fading into the background. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted between us, not in a dramatic, life-altering way, but in a subtle, quiet way that felt just as powerful. We didn't need to say anything else. The stars above us, the quiet connection between us, it was enough. And as we eventually made our way back inside, I knew that this night, this moment would stay with me for a long time to come. The morning sunlight poured into the kitchen, dappling the table where we all gathered for breakfast. My sister was busy flipping pancakes, her laughter bright as she teased her husband about something. The smell of coffee and maple syrup filled the air, and for the first time in a long time I felt content. Ryan sat across from me, his hair slightly messy from sleep, his eyes still carrying the softness of the night before. Every now and then, his gaze would flicker toward me and I felt my cheeks warm despite myself. You're quiet this morning, my sister commented, nudging me playfully as she set a plate in front of me. Just enjoying the calm, I replied with a smile. Ryan's voice cut in, smooth and teasing. Don't worry, Auntie. I'll fix that soon enough. I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me. After breakfast, Ryan leaned over the back of my chair, his voice low so only I could hear. I've got an idea. There's a lake not far from here. Perfect for a bike ride. What do you say? I hesitated for a moment, glancing at my sister, but Ryan nudged my shoulder. Come on. You could use some fresh air. Besides, he added with a grin, I'll even let you try to keep up with me. I scoffed at his confidence. You're on. A short while later we were pedaling down a dirt path that wound through fields and forests, the breeze cool against my skin. Ryan rode ahead, occasionally looking back with that cheeky grin of his, calling out little challenges. You're slowing down, Auntie. Don't tell me city life has made you soft. I'm pacing myself. I shot back, laughing despite myself. The ride wasn't just refreshing. It was fun. We fell into an easy rhythm, teasing each other and pointing out little landmarks along the way. A tree shaped like a heart, a pair of deer darting through the woods. By the time the lake came into view, my cheeks ached from smiling so much. The lake was beautiful, its surface shimmering under the sun. We parked our bikes near a tree and found a spot on the grass, close enough to the water that we could feel the coolness of the breeze coming off of it. Ryan stretched out on the grass, leaning back on his elbows, his legs casually crossed. So, he said, looking at me with a crooked smile, tell me about your life. What's new? I laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Not much. Work keeps me busy. You know how it is. He tilted his head, his gaze curious. And outside of work? Anyone special? The question caught me off guard and I felt a faint blush rise to my cheeks. Why are you so interested? He shrugged, a playful glint in his eye. Just making conversation. Besides, I have to vet anyone who thinks they're good enough for you. I laughed, shaking my head. I think you're getting a little ahead of yourself. Not really, he said, his tone more serious now. You're incredible. Whoever you're with should know that. The words hung in the air between us and I felt my chest tighten. He said it so casually, so sincerely that I didn't know how to respond. Well, I said after a pause, trying to keep my voice light, no one's lined up at the moment. But thank you for the vote of confidence. Ryan smiled and for a moment neither of us spoke. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake's water and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. You know, he said, breaking the silence, I don't think you realize how amazing you are. I looked at him, surprised by the sudden intensity in his voice. You've always been the kind of person who makes people feel seen, he continued, his eyes locked on mine. Like they matter. It's rare. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he leaned closer, his expression soft and thoughtful. Ryan, I started, but the words caught in my throat as he reached out, brushing a stray hair from my face. Can I tell you something? He asked, his voice low. I nodded, unsure of where this was going but unable to look away. I've always looked up to you, he admitted. Even when I was a kid. But now... He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the ground for a moment before meeting mine again. Now I see you differently. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. His words, his closeness. It was overwhelming in a way I couldn't quite explain. Ryan, But he didn't let me finish. He leaned in, his expression open, and kissed me gently on the cheek, a gesture that was unexpectedly tender. Caught me off guard not because it was inappropriate but because it was sincere, a quiet moment of admiration not expectation. I froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His courage, his openness, it was disarming, and before I could say anything he pulled back, his cheeks flushed. I'm sorry if that was too much, he said quietly, his eyes darting away. I needed to say how I feel. You've always meant a lot to me. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. Ryan, thank you for being honest. I'm proud of the man you're becoming. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken emotions, but we both seemed to understand that nothing needed to be said. The connection between us, warm and genuine, was enough. As we rode back home later that day, the quiet moments by the lake stayed with me, a reminder of how relationships can grow and evolve in unexpected ways. It was a day I wouldn't soon forget. The house had settled into a quiet stillness by the time I retreated to my room. The day's events lingered in my mind, replaying in vivid detail. The lake, Ryan's kind words, his unexpected confession, and the way his gaze had stayed with me, even as we rode home in silence. I had thought that by slipping into bed and turning off the lights, my mind would quiet. But it was the opposite. My heart felt restless, my thoughts tangled in emotions I couldn't yet untangle. How had things changed so much in just one day? I was deep in this spiral when I heard the softest knock at my door. It was hesitant, almost like a question, and I froze, unsure of what to do. Before I could decide, the door creaked open and Ryan stepped inside, a cup of tea in each hand. I thought you might like this, he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. He didn't wait for permission, instead walking over and setting one of the cups on my bedside table before sitting on the edge of the bed. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room was dim, the moonlight spilling through the window enough to cast gentle shadows across his face. He looked nervous, his usual confidence muted. Can't sleep either? I asked, my voice breaking the stillness. He shook his head, his gaze flickering to the floor. No. Too much on my mind. I nodded, my fingers tracing the rim of the cup. Me too. There was another pause, heavier this time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady but laced with vulnerability. Can I ask you something? I looked at him, unsure of where this was going but unable to deny the pull of his sincerity. Of course. Do you love me? He asked, the words falling from his lips so simply, like he'd been carrying them all day and couldn't hold them any longer. His eyes met mine, unflinching, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped his own cup tightly. If you don't, tell me now and I promise I won't ever bring it up again. My heart stopped. The weight of his question pressed against my chest, and I felt the world narrow to just the two of us, the rest of the house fading into irrelevance. I didn't know how to answer. Or maybe I did, but I was too afraid to say it out loud. Ryan, I started, my voice faltering. I placed the tea on the table beside me, unable to think straight while holding it. I need to know, he said quietly. I can't keep feeling this way if it's one-sided. The raw honesty in his voice cracked something open in me, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. How could I explain the storm of emotions he'd stirred in me? How he'd made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years? How I had spent all day fighting this impossible connection but couldn't deny it any longer. Yes, I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. I do. Ryan's breath hitched, his shoulders visibly relaxing as relief washed over him. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. You do. I nodded, my voice steadier now. I know it's not right. I know it's complicated. But I can't lie to you. I feel something for you, Ryan. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that left me breathless. That's all I needed to hear. Before I could say anything else, he leaned in, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tender and searching. It wasn't rushed or frantic, just soft, hesitant, like he was afraid I might pull away at any moment. I didn't. When we broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm against my skin. I don't know what this means, he admitted. I don't know what we're supposed to do now. Neither do I said honestly. But we'll figure it out. Together. He smiled faintly, and for the first time all day, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. Ryan shifted, lying down beside me on top of the covers, his hand still holding mine. The quiet between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was comforting. We didn't need to say anything else. The unspoken understanding between us was enough for now. As I lay there, his presence steady and grounding, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Whatever tomorrow brought, I knew this moment would stay with me. A reminder of how life could surprise you even when you thought you had everything figured out.